out here at UC Sproul Plaza in front of Sproul Hall, and the strike now has gone on longer than 3 weeks at UC. 48,000 graduate students, researchers, doctoral students, TAs, and they are fighting for COLA, they're fighting for housing, and this is an important working class issue, not just for the UC workers, but for all workers in the United States. And joining us is Harvey Smith, who has been an activist fighter at UC, fighting against privatization, particularly of People's Park, but the whole corporatization of the university.
I am a member of the People's Park Historic District Advocacy Group, and we're the ones that work to get People's Park placed on the National Register of Historic Places and have pursued challenging UC in court to preserve the park. We've been working on this struggle for over 3 years. We've seen UC deploy high-paid lawyers and PR flacks in the effort to sway the public that they're doing the right thing. And I think that sounds familiar to anybody that's on strike right now. The strikers are fighting for better wages and benefits, but also housing. It's a key element of the package they're negotiating. Housing is also central to the struggle over People's Park. We know UC has alternative sites and does not have to destroy a park to build more housing. Their own planning documents prove it. Likewise, we also know UC has the ability to meet the strikers' demands. A recent article by Matthew Towser in the San Francisco Examiner explored the connections between the strike and UC's failed housing policy. We're all too familiar with UC's boast about its plan to build more housing. UC has neglected building more housing for over 50 years until we have the crisis now on our hands. We all need to question the direction of UC. It clearly has the resources to meet the demands of the strikers. This is in the public interest and would fulfill the mission of UC to serve society. However, the behavior of UC administration is becoming increasingly corporate-like. This impacts both UC workers and UC students. I know firsthand, I've been both. But the strikers may not want to know what I paid for tuition as an undergrad. Nothing. Only $99 in fees. UC has monetized its real estate holdings. Why else would UC Berkeley call its real estate and development division Capital Strategies? I can point to just one example that I know because there's a new building called Berkeley Way West. It's outside of the campus core. It's within in the boundaries of the city of Berkeley. This building, 5-story building, contains 3 schools that were displaced from the campus core. The School of Education and the School of Psychology and the School of Public Health. So they're all in this one building. The 3 schools between them used to have 2 libraries. This new building has no libraries. What I thought naively would be library space is now rented out to commercial restaurant chains. The top 2 floors of the building are rented out to Microsoft. So this building represents, pushing really important academic endeavors off campus. And what do we need more in this society right now than psychology, education, and public health? But they're pushed, off the campus core. And then the building competes with commercial Berkeley real estate and Berkeley restaurants. So again, a perfect example of monetization, but only one, okay? There are many others. So the strikers deserve a living wage and affordable housing. In the increasingly dense South Side, we need more parks and open space, as well as more student housing. So I would say, keep fighting for what's fair. We'll continue our legal and organizing efforts to resist UC's mean-spirited social engineering plans. We're in solidarity with the strikers because it's really one struggle on 2 fronts. So I'd urge people to visit our website, People's Park Historic District Advocacy Group, and contact us if you have any questions about People's Park and this broader struggle against the corporate-like behavior of UC.
We're here today in front of Sproul Plaza on Saturday, December the 3rd, and we're here to show solidarity for the strikers and also to show that this is an ongoing struggle. The fight that they have against the regents, against the administration, has been going on for decades, many decades of struggle against privatization, corporatization, and union busting at the University of California. And joining us is Brechin. He's a geographer here and author of Imperial San Francisco, and he has been fighting also for many decades for public control of a public university.
Well, I came to this university 55 years ago. Hard to believe, it's more than half a century. I was an undergraduate in 1967. When I came here, it was a very different place at that time. Of course, there was virtually no tuition at that time. There was a fee, but there was, it was inconsequential. And we foolishly took that as our birthright as Californians, because the people of California paid for what they liked to still refer to as the crown jewel of California, the UC system. But in about 10 years later, in 1978, a cheap huckster named Howard Jarvis persuaded the voters of California that they shouldn't have to pay taxes. And the implication being that you could have it all without paying taxes. But that's not the way it works, of course, in an adult world. And the Proposition 13, as it was called, actually began the long, slow slide of this university from a public to a private university, despite what the administration still says and despite all appearances to the contrary. And that's, of course, why so many of the strikers, I would say practically all of the strikers, can no longer afford to teach and make a living at the same time. And so many of the students find it so difficult to actually come to school here, which, as I said, was my birthright. Many of the students today are actually sleeping in their cars because they simply can't afford housing anymore. Well, I came back to UC late in life, and I got my doctorate when I was 51 here. My advisor handed me my diploma in 1998. And let's see, right after that, I agreed to teach a class of over 100 students here. That class paid me $5,000 flat with no benefits. And I don't think I've ever been so tired in my life, except earlier when I only had a master's degree and I was a freeway flyer trying to teach at 3 different Bay Area colleges. And so what I decided to do after that, because I just realized that a university that puts that kind of value or non-value on its PhDs was simply not worth teaching at. I just said screw it, and never taught another class, certainly not here. But of course, I had the luxury of that, but many of the strikers here don't have that luxury. They either can't afford not to teach, or they can't afford to teach at all. So how did the university become so poor that it can't afford to give a living wage? The answers are many and complex. They have a lot to do with administrative bloat, which has just grown enormously since I was an undergraduate or even a graduate here. But one thing that is seldom talked about is the billion-dollar overhang, debt overhang, of rebuilding Cal Memorial Stadium at the mouth of Strawberry Canyon. Shouldn't have been built there in the first place, but then to rebuild it was absolute folly. And they did that despite Professor Brian Barsky's accurate prediction of the financial disaster that it would be and who would have to pay for that. and also against the advice of Professor Garnis Curtis, who was probably the world authority on the Berkeley Hills, who said that in addition to building it on top of the Hayward Fault, it was right below an unstable hillside that could slide during a quake, because that's what happens in quakes. By the way, the university's lobbyists managed to get a midnight exemption for the university from the Alquist-Priolo Act, which is supposed to prevent large occupancy structures from going up on or near the earthquake fault. The consequences of that is that anybody now associated with the university, students or teaching assistants or anybody else, is having to foot the bill for that billion-dollar fiasco. And nobody is held responsible for that, certainly not the regents or the administrators who okayed that against the advice of people who knew much better at the time. Well, I am part of the Living New Deal, which is a nationwide team effort to rediscover the physical remains of the New Deal from Franklin Roosevelt's administration, which are all around us, but which we don't see. And I'm very interested in what I call the lost ethical language of the New Deal. We've been persuaded to forget what the New Deal did because of the normative savagery of neoliberalism, which has supplanted the New Deal and the Great Society. In his last State of the Union address, a year before he died, Franklin Roosevelt enunciated an 8-point Second Bill of Rights, which he said should be every American's birthright, just as no tuition once was for mine. The first two rights were these: the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. Number two, the right to earn enough to provide enough adequate food and clothing and recreation. But FDR saved what was perhaps most important for a functioning democracy for last. Number 8, the right to a good education. And by that, he meant a free education. It's up to you to begin securing those rights for yourselves and for others who will follow.
So, Greg, maybe you can talk about who runs the university. The regents are appointed by the governor of California. Do they represent the public, or do they have other interests in mind at that level?
Well, of course they don't represent the public. I mean, it's traditionally been a kind of cushy position with great status attached to it because of those who donate money to whoever happens to be the governor and or their party. And so it tends to be, of course, the elite. And up until fairly recently, it wasn't representative of the overall population of California at all. I mean, basically what you had to be to qualify is rich. And so these people are oligarchs. Now, when I was an undergraduate here in the 60s, the Radical Student Union actually did the kind of investigative reporting that is not done today, because I think very few of the students here are even aware that they're governed by this board of regents, let alone who they are. And so what they did is they turned out a report which showed graphically who these people were, what their conflicts of interest were, and above all, because there also at that time was a questioning of the appropriateness of the University of California supporting 2 nuclear weapons labs, which are the shadow campuses of the University of California, though they're never mentioned or seldom mentioned at all, although their photographs are given equal prominence with the 11 other campus branches at the University of California headquarters in Oakland. So what this report did, that the Radical Student Union did, it showed the conflicts of interest and how many of the regents actually had interests in nuclear power and nuclear weaponry. Well, you don't hear that anymore at all. But also they have interest in banking and railroads and real estate, etc. So if you were to do a kind of study like that today, you would probably find that a number of those regents such as Richard Blum, for example, Dianne Feinstein's billionaire husband, who is recently deceased, but nobody would do any kind of investigation into his interests, may have real estate interests, for example, in downtown Berkeley, which is now being high-rised ostensibly for the welfare of the students. But we need to have that kind of investigative reporting that, of course, the Daily Californian isn't doing. I mean, it requires a lot of digging. It's very hard today to find out who owns what, especially as far as real estate goes, because it's hidden behind so many corporate veils, and that is not accidental at all. When I was doing my book, Imperial San Francisco, I found over 100 years ago there were these things called block books that anybody who was involved in real estate, anybody who wanted to, could have, and you could see who owned what land because it was right there on the maps. If you can even find a property ownership map today, which isn't easy, you're not going to see individual names. You are going to see LLCs. You are going to see trusts, etc. And it is almost impossible to find out who's behind that. But some of those people are probably going to be regents, or at least their families. Unfortunately, as I say, we just don't know who these people really are. They're not discussed. They're not investigated. They just are appointed, and they run this university. Oh, and of course, the other thing is that they generally believe in the tenets of neoliberalism. You can call it late capitalism if you want, and that is that you pay for your services. And thus, of course, the students have to keep paying more and more for what should be free. A free public education and a quality education at that. And it's the same at the state universities as well, too, and of course at the community colleges. The fees, the tuition is going up everywhere because essentially all of these have been privatized, largely because of Proposition 13, which stanched the taxes that are necessary to pay for a good, free, quality education, which is essential for a democracy. When I was going to school here, I believe the state subsidy for the university was 65%. It's now down to 9 to 11%. So all of that difference has to be made up by corporate funding, by private philanthropy, etc., and that means that the university is beholden to its donors increasingly.
And, if the university really had a public mission and was dedicated to that, what it would do is the world's premier institution of public education, it would educate the voting public of California about that reality. It would say, we want to continue our mission. We want to provide tuition free to the students of California. Rather than that what Gray just said, it kind of goes along with the neoliberal paradigm and just marches along, and then increasingly cozies up to corporate actors.
Well, one of the demands of the strikers is COLA, cost of living, with inflation, and the issue of housing. I mean, these are issues for the students, for the faculty, for the staff, but all working people in California and nationally. And the regents, who are multimillionaires, sometimes billionaires, they apparently they support this union-busting management that has flagrantly violated labor laws. The head of labor relations here at UC worked for Jackson Brown and was a union busting firm that fought the Amazon workers who were trying to organize. Are you surprised about the lack of any support from Governor Newsom or the legislature, which are directly responsible for oversight of the University of California?
I'm not surprised at all. Basically, they don't want the structure of the university known. How it's run, because obviously he has enormous power, the governor, in appointing the regents. Now, he has been appointing people of color, for example, so at least superficially it looks a lot better than it used to when it was just a white boys club. But ultimately, there aren't anybody on the board like Yori Wada, for example, who was appointed by the first Governor Brown in his first term. There isn't anybody who's going to rock the boat now. And Harvey made a very good point that, the university should be teaching critical thinking, and one of the parts of the university in which that could be done would be the Graduate School of Journalism, the vaunted Graduate School of Journalism on the north side. And I co-taught a class on investigative journalism at that school, and I found the limits of investigation at that time because I kept insisting that one of the regents, Richard Blum, who has a namesake building directly next to the Graduate School of Journalism, his conflicts of interest with his wife, Senator Feinstein, should be investigating. And I was shut down. It never happened, but the Graduate School of Journalism they should assign this as a project of who are the regents, what are their interests, the kind of things that was done when I was an undergraduate here in the late 60s. That's not being done. So along with the collapse of American journalism as private equity is taking it over and stripping the newsrooms of the kind of gumshoe investigative reportings that we used to have, so that isn't being done, it's going on right here at the University of California. Because when the university becomes essentially privatized, the administration does not want to rock the boat of how things are actually run, and who knows how it's being run.
So do you think this should be taken up by the union, the UAW, the other unions, AFSCME, Q, UPTE, the issue of the structure of the university, and what is the purpose of this university as a public, which they call itself a public university?
Well, absolutely the union should take it up because, of course, it's working class people, such as my family was, who need the advantage of free, quality, higher education, which is why I was able to climb out of the working class, and so many other people want to as well too. You can't do that without an adequate education. And that's what these institutions, the three tiers of higher education in UC, were supposed to do. But they're failing miserably on that, so the unions are the only ones I can think of right now who could do that kind of work. But how are you going to get it out to the broader public with the media as tightly controlled now by billionaires, largely, people such as Elon Musk, for example, who is the kind of, and Rupert Murdoch, the new William Randolph Hearsts of our time, who tightly control what is said, but more importantly, what is not going to be said and what the public is not going to know. The unions should take this on, but it's very hard work and it's very time-consuming work.
And this struggle is the largest strike in education workers in California. The other strike that more than 50 years ago was at San Francisco State University for ethnic studies and for open admissions for all. It seems that struggle today continues, and in fact, the need to mobilize the entire working class to support this strike is very important, that it's not just an issue for the students, the strikers, but all working people of California.
Absolutely. And I mean, as a three-time alumnus of the university, I'm really pained to see the damage that this necessary strike is doing to this institution, but I also think it's necessary because it's become so bad now with the students, and the graduate instructors, et cetera, not being able to make a living wage, certainly not being able to have families.
Is this slave labor?
It's virtually slave labor, yeah. I could see this coming when I gave a commencement address at the geography department about 20 years ago. I could see it coming because I remember I said in that the fees would become so great that people would not, who go through here, and especially those who teach, would not be able eventually to have families. And that is the situation right now. If you have a family and you're an instructor, you are going to be totally impoverished by teaching at this university. That is totally wrong. And so, despite the damage that's being done to this and to the students who go here, it's absolutely necessary. It's like Mario Savio said on the steps of this very building, sometimes you just have to throw your body onto the wheels and gears until it stops, and that's what's happening now. And it's hurting everybody, but it has to be done. You know, the same thing is happening in Britain right now. The people in Britain are now being so immiserated by inflation, by fuel costs, etc., by the cutbacks to the national health, to every aspect of public life, that essentially what's happening now is that they're having a second general strike. Essentially, the country's being shut down. And I'm all in favor of it because it has to be done.
And the railroad workers here, a few days ago, the Congress ordered them back to work without sick pay.
Yeah.
I mean, and you have Warren Buffett, this billionaire who owns BNSF, the railway. So this Congress, Biden and the Democrats, Bernie Sanders allowed this vote to go forward. It seems like they're at the behest of the billionaires. I mean, they couldn't force Warren Buffett and the other billionaires who own the railways to pay sick pay. I mean,
well, I got to say, Steve, that, you know, I mean, given the current complexion of the Congress, I mean, we're all over a barrel because of this, because the Republicans are going to do everything they can to just poke a pole.
they could have allowed a strike.
I guess they could have. Yeah.
They could have allowed a strike, and then a strike would have forced the companies to actually provide sick leave. But they didn't allow a strike. The Democrats, who are in charge of Congress, allowed it was a bipartisan vote of the Democrats and Republicans to impose this bill. So.
Yes.
Well, they could have voted on the sick leave, too.
Well, the Republicans would have voted against the sick leave. They did vote against the sick leave, but they could have said, you know, you're going to have to pay sick leave, and that's the only way you're going to get a government order. I mean, you know, you're going to have to provide sick leave. They didn't do that. So, I mean, it's pretty clear who they're listening to.
Well, yes, and actually, frankly, I'm kind of surprised they didn't allow the strike to go on because it would wreck the American economy, for which President Biden would be blamed, as he has been, for the hike in oil costs, even though that has largely to do with the war in Ukraine. So, I mean, they will do anything they can to sink the Biden administration, and probably having a strike would have done just that.
Although the working class in this country are furious and angry about their conditions, and the idea that the government should tell workers they don't have the right to strike, whether it's railroad workers or any workers, is an attack on democratic rights. When they talk about Poland, solidarity, supporting rights of workers in other countries, and then they say to American workers, you don't have those rights.
Yes.
Well, the contradictions abound. You know, getting back to UC, one of the contradictions is the fact that the university touts its program of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But as Gray was saying, as the campus becomes more supposedly inclusive, you can't survive financially. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like putting out the welcome mat, but actually pulling it out from under people at the same time. Yeah, and you know, the Board of Regents is visible, but the UC Berkeley chancellor has another board called the Board of Visitors. No one's ever heard of this, but it's corporate types, you know, and this is what the blurb on the board talks about, advising the chancellor on strategy of all types. So we don't see the chancellor with a board of labor or a board of community. It's a board of corporate types. So it's throughout the university, this mindset of you know, behaving like a corporation is everywhere.
Okay, well, thank you.
Could I say one other thing? I've attended Board of Regents meetings. Most people haven't, but during the last strike here at UC, I went to one of the meetings over at Mission Bay, where they have a big auditorium. And what struck me is that the public, which is in that case the strikers, were given half hour to speak at the very beginning of the meeting. And I watched the regents. They couldn't have cared less. Many of them were reading their newspapers, they were looking at their laptops, etc., just to get it out of the way, and then they go on and they do their business as if there had been no public testimony at all. You can see why the students, the strikers, etc., are so furious, because you can protest politely, but you're going to be completely ignored by the people who really matter.